What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another Game Time Discussions. I'm Emery Cuzzy. I'm sitting here with Cameron Selby, and we're going to be doing our power rankings updated for Week 10. It's a lot of actually really happened in the NFL. Trade deadline happened as we're recording this. Basically, the trade deadline has ended, so there's not going to be any new players going to new teams. We'll talk about some of those guys that have gone to new teams, and will hopefully help change their dynamic and help them get into farther into the playoffs.
Yeah, we waited an extra week to do this to make it an exact halfway point. So we are 9 weeks through. There's 18 weeks in the season, so this is smack dab the halfway point. We've basically have a really good impression of the big gaps between the really bad teams, the ones that aren't good but have a shot, the really good playoff caliber teams, and then the Super Bowl contenders. And there's movement all around. But kind of starting off, I wish we could fit more because there's a couple more bad teams that I think deserve to be on this first slide. But not much changing. New England starting out 32. That's where they were last time. They've lost 7 of 8.
Right.
The only game that they won was one that was an unprecedented historical win in terms of being outgained, losing turnover battle, out yardage, and still somehow won. And then they lose a overtime game to Tennessee, who's also on this list. And whoever would have won that game would have been in that spot. New Orleans and Carolina had a similar outing on Sunday as well, where Carolina was outgained, turnover battle, all that stuff, and they still somehow won.
Yes.
And then New Orleans, ends up trading in a couple teams. So again, it took a while for them to get here, but this is where we kind of had them at the very, very start of the season. Then we had to give them the respect where it was due after the first 2 weeks and how hot of a start they had offensively, and now it's really dropped off. And now these 4 teams are fighting for the top pick.
Yeah, we kind of talked about all these teams. These teams in our first slides kind of all were in this area. I believe we had them at least below 27 at that point. So we've been pretty close on all these teams. Looking at New England, they've actually been interesting because they won 2 games against teams that we thought, I believe both of us picked to win their division. Their divisions.
Cincinnati
and the Jets. So
2 weeks ago.
Very interesting there. Cincinnati still has a chance to win that division. The Jets need a lot more help. But and then looking at New Orleans came out of the gate super hot, like you said, beating Dallas by, what did they win by? 90. It was like 94 to
the first 2 weeks of the seasons were 91 to 29 point difference.
That's just crazy.
And then rails have fallen off. They had 3 straight losses of at least 3 touchdowns. And then last week, again, against Carolina on the road, team they had already beaten by 37 in week 1 and found a way to lose that game. And it's just been a lot of bad vibes around that.
Tennessee added, I just want to add them into this before we switch over. They have had some quarterback issues with Will Levis being out. Also, Tyjae Spears has been out a lot. They traded DeAndre Hopkins. Their team does not look the same as it did in week 1, basically, is how I'm getting at it. And as we said prior, they just play in a really tough division and hard to come out of that when Mason Rudolph is throwing for 85 yards.
Yeah, and they have a ton of guys on IR too, and also they traded away DeAndre Hopkins. We saw him go off last night, Monday Night Football against the Buccaneers. But yeah, injuries on the offensive line, in the secondary, all that stuff. So it's not really an area where they really have a strength anymore, and so they're just kind of making it through the rest of the way. I mean, the rest of the schedule, actually, they might pull out some more wins than they would like to admit. But yeah, they're going to be fighting for a top 5 pick, and I don't know how many first round top 10 caliber quarterbacks there will be, but there's a few of these teams that are going to be vying for those guys, and it's going to potentially turn into another situation where you're like this all over again in a couple of years.
Well, let's talk about those teams on the next slide. The first team that is going to be looking for a quarterback that we said should have picked a quarterback last year is the Las Vegas Raiders. 2-7 up to this point, have played 3 quarterbacks. Desmond Ridder did come in for Gardner Minshew in this last weekend's game because nobody can move the ball for them, basically. It really hurts our pass catchers that we like, in Jacoby Myers and Brock Bowers, since Devontae Adams is gone. And so they've just looked pretty awful. They do have a bye, but then they play Miami, Denver, KC. So tough.
Yeah, it's a tough way to go. 2-7, 5 of their losses have been by double digits. They won a close one against Cleveland at home. And then, they squeaked by a Baltimore team, which was an impressive win, but that was also at this point 7-8 weeks ago. So
Right.
they're really trending in the wrong direction. At least they have a bye, so they won't be losing this week. But it also is interesting that I don't know if you saw the narrative, but basically Shadur doing a tweet of praise God every week, coincidentally, that the Raiders have lost or something of that nature, trying to maybe weasel his way to the program. And I don't think that will end well if that ends up being the case. But, we have a whole offseason to talk about that because they're probably the most popular team that you would probably match make him with.
Well, no matter where they're picking a quarterback in the first round. So if he's gone, they're going Cam Ward or Carson Beck or whoever. If he's not the first pick as the quarterback overall, too, is the thing. So there's a lot of stuff to talk about for quarterbacks in this upcoming class. Some of them are standing out a lot more than others, but the Raiders have to get one of them, even if it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be a franchise guy. The New York Giants have a franchise guy, they thought. Daniel Jones has been subpar. He's been okay, actually, but they can't win games. 2-7, losing games. The only games they've won against Seattle and Cleveland. Cleveland is also on this board, so that's not that impressive. But every other game, just been a really tough road. They've had some close games. They've kind of been able to stay in against Washington. Both games have been within 5, but
yeah, I mean, other than a blowout loss to Philly and Minnesota week 1, where Minnesota had it over at halftime, every score has been a one-score game. So they've been at least competitive. They're actually a 5.5-point favorite this week against Carolina. That's in Germany. I don't know how Germans should be happy about that.
Terrible game.
I said that at the very beginning of the season, of all the games you're going to give us, that's the one you're going to give.
Right.
So who knows? Maybe it's an entertaining one. We'll be live streaming on Sunday, and that'll be going on, and we probably don't care. But it's interesting nonetheless. Jacksonville, another tough loss. Game they had no business being in. We're down 22-0 and had the ball, and a pick in the end zone is what kind of settled the score against Philly. Again, it's just really hard to fathom, the decline of this. And I'm actually surprised that Doug Peterson has survived this long.
Yeah,
with
for
as
sure.
Frustrating as it has been for the last, you can even call it a full calendar year at this point, because their woes started right around this time last year.
I think the problem for me is that they're talented. Mm-hmm. This is why Doug Peterson should not be there, is because they have a talented roster, in my opinion, and they're still not winning games. Defensively, they have good pass rushers. Trayvon Walker's coming on. Josh Hines Allen is good. It's they have good players. They just can't put it together. And they actually have a quarterback. So that's why they're above the Raiders in this ranking, mostly because we have Desmond Ridder playing this year, while they have Trevor Lawrence, who has been able to, at least if he's a game manager at best, fine, make him a game manager, but you need to win games. You should not be losing to the Bears by 19. You shouldn't be losing to Buffalo by 37. Those types of games you have to, and they've had close games, but you have to be able to find a way to keep those big losses closer and find a way to just win games, at home against Cleveland.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, they do have a lot of divisional games going up, and really no one's running away. Mm-hmm. I mean, Houston has regressed kind of in front of our very eyes, and it doesn't. They had a really bad loss against the Jets this past Thursday night. Jacksonville's schedule is somewhat reasonable. I think at this point, the hole is too big to climb out of.
Fair.
But I mean, if they win on some kind of run, and the target was, 8-9, 9-8, I think they're capable of being able to get there. But I'm no longer in that ballpark of just wishful thinking,
right,
thinking that they will at this point.
For sure. The Cleveland Browns, Jameis Winston comes back, starts for them after Deshaun Watson goes out, and he wins his first game against Baltimore. Baltimore, losing to teams like the Raiders and Cleveland, we've already talked about. It's pretty interesting. We'll talk about them a little later, obviously, but Cleveland had a really tough schedule to come out, right, and that kind of puts the damper on them. But also, when they come back from bye, as you can see on the board, they have a bye this week. They play New Orleans, who's in shambles. Good Pittsburgh team. Then they play Denver. They still have to play their AFC North teams. It's just really hard to see them just making any run anytime soon.
Right. And yeah, again, this was the team that we had the biggest differentiation on in terms of predicted record. And a lot of mine was just kind of the schedule was too tough at the end. Well, they didn't even get to that point to even
Right.
to see of like wait and see on how this team will turn out. I did see it's funny that I think Jameis Winston, who just had his second start, he was our puke stack of the week 2 weeks ago, and then last week
Right.
kind of came back to earth. He's second in the NFL with 5 dropped interceptions. He's only played 2 games,
It's amazing.
and he had 3 interceptions this past game. So that's even though he had a fun week for us a couple weeks ago, he is 8 interceptable passes in 2 games. It's just going all downhill for this team, and they
Right.
probably have the bleakest future of this entire first 8 that we've talked about.
Yeah, that's fair. One thing I will say though is Deshaun Watson, while playing, didn't have a single game over 200 passing yards, which is something that you have to. He's supposed to be a superstar. You paid all this money for him. You switched all these trades and yada yada yada. Jameis had a game of 334. So
Right.
he actually gives them a better chance to win. And even with all those interceptions we talked about at Famous Jameis, he's going to try to win the game. He's going to throw a pick or he's going to throw a touchdown. You might get both actually 3 or 4 times a game.
Yeah,
So
they're going to be somebody we'll be talking about this offseason of like, how can we even try to predict or make the most of the situation they have, because they're really, really screwed for the next couple of years with their Deshaun contract and the guaranteed money that he has. But moving on, Miami Dolphins, we didn't expect them to be down this low. They actually moved up a little bit, but that was right, in the middle of the IR for Tua and how horrible they looked with their makeshift backups that they were playing. And they've dropped 2 winnable games to the last 2 against good teams, against Arizona and Buffalo, who are both leading their divisions right now. But both of them, they had those games in the bag or had opportunities to come out on top, and they just did not. And so now they're really, really in trouble and could be going the wrong way. They weren't any kind of sellers at the deadline, but right now they're just not in a great spot.
Yeah, I was going to say, they got lucky that their bye week was week 6 because of the Tua injury. It was right in the middle of his injury. But losing games to Tennessee while Tyler Huntley's your starting quarterback sucks. Of course, Indy by 6 while Tyler Huntley's your starting quarterback. Like, those games are winnable with Tua in. So I know we're putting him at 24 because we kind of like want to, or we kind of have to at this point. But at the same time, looking at their outlook, I think it's on the rise more so, which is always a good thing for a team. I wish, obviously, they could have gotten one of these games between Buffalo and Arizona, though.
Yeah, I mean, 3 of their next 5 are against teams that are last in their divisions, which is the Raiders, the Patriots, and the Jets, and then road games on a Monday night against the Rams and a short week against Green Bay.
Right.
Those aren't always shoo-ins, but I mean, there is a schedule there to kind of turn around a little bit. Again, you wonder if they've kind of dug themselves in too deep of a hole. But also the AFC as a whole is not nearly as strong as we thought it would be after last year.
Right.
And so, maybe though that 10-win threshold that we thought for sure you had to get to, maybe there might be a 9-8 team or 2 that sneak in. And if Tua is healthy, they at least have the firepower enough to, win games. So,
right, for sure.
Completely agree. They're just kind of a wait and see team at this point.
And then with the Jets going up next, they've been... Well, they go out and they get Devontae Adams, so they basically have a bad team and they add a superstar receiver, but they're still a bad team. Firing Robert Saleh was not necessarily my favorite thing that they did during this season, but getting some offensive help isn't a bad idea. Losing 5 straight looked bad, but then they do beat the Houston Texans this last week, 21-13. Like we said, Houston is not Houston that we thought they were, but it's still a really good win. They have opportunities with the end of their schedule to, make a run though.
Yeah, I mean, the only real playoff team right now, or that would currently be in the playoffs, I guess Arizona is one, which they are on the road against, which I wouldn't be shocked if they won that game. And then they have on the road against Buffalo, who they just went down tooth and wire a couple weeks ago on Monday Night Football. So other than that, everybody else is a losing team. So, they could string some wins together and all of a sudden be kind of right there. But it's just hard to be optimistic when just so much has gone wrong with this team so far this year.
Unfortunately, their defense didn't look like we expected that either. The Colts at 4-5, they're one of my least favorite teams in the NFL. Benching Anthony Richardson, I do love their defensive line. That's fine, but on offense, they just have nothing really going for them. And we kind of realized that even more so in this game against Minnesota, where they had 13 points.
Yeah. So. It is funny though that all 9 games so far this year have come down to one possession.
Right.
So they're kind of right down the middle of just, how it typically goes with subpar teams, kind of a 500 ball club that, can basically beat anybody, but then they can also lose to anybody as well. So they, getting swept against Houston doesn't help. Also lost to Jacksonville, so you're already 0-3 in your division, or 1-3 rather. You did beat Tennessee, but it's an uphill battle. I think we both agree that while Anthony Richardson, that's not a move they probably should have made, it does in the short term at least help them more capable of winning games and, like you said, moving the ball like Jameis Winston does as opposed to Deshaun. So they're on the road or they're at home against Buffalo this week as a home dog, but then Jets, Lions, Patriots, and then before their late bye, and then they have 4 non-playoff teams with the losing records to possibly finish the season strong, and they pretty much, is whether we like it or not, might be a wild card team.
Absolutely. And then the Dallas Cowboys, one of the most disappointing teams in football right now. 3-5, Dak being out for the next 4 games, most likely. Just seeing those games that are up there that kind of matter. All 3 division games, and then Houston is just a big game in general for I believe that's on Monday Night Football.
Yes.
Yeah, that's on my birthday. Perfect. Yeah, so those 4 games are big, and they're coming off 3 straight losses to really good teams: Detroit, San Francisco, Atlanta, all teams that are probably going to be in the playoffs. But it does not set them up well that Cooper Rush is going to be starting versus these next 4 games.
Even though it only says that they lost 1 spot, it doesn't feel like there's a team that has gotten that big of a gap worse. I think that they just had a tough start to the year, and we ranked it right after the Giants game, which they barely held on to, and so they're 2-2, had 2 blowout losses, and both at home. So we were kind of a little harsh on them, but right now it's truly they're going in the wrong direction. At least optimistically, it sounds like Micah Parsons is back this week, but they were down their top 4 pass rushers. DBs have been in and out of the lineup injured this year. Their line has not looked good. Their rookie has not looked good. Their right tackle still is not good. And then, they make a trade for Jonathan Mingo, but they give up more than they got for in his prime Amari Cooper a few years ago. And so it's just, this team is just not very good. They're going to be a dog in at least the next 3 games with Philly, Houston, and Washington. And then the Giants might be a pick 'em. And all of a sudden you're 3-8 fighting for a top 5 pick instead of being close to a wild card spot. And so it's going to be really rough and frustrating into the season. And I just don't know really how it gets better from here.
Well, it doesn't, because then they play, since after this grouping here, they play Cincinnati. They get a Carolina team, but at Carolina, Tampa Bay, Philly, and then Washington. So it's not like it's going to get easier. It's going to just be just as difficult after that game, or after the New York game that's up there. So,
and there are always above average or really good teams that just get the injury bug, and the Chargers and Bengals were it last year, where the Chargers were a top 5 pick, but they literally had their quarterback, both edge rushers go down, etc. and so on. And then on top of that, had a bad coach. So that feels like that's what Dallas is turning into. But they're also, kind of trapped themselves a little bit with their extensions that they have with CD and Dak.
Yeah, for sure.
Both of them together next year combined for about 45% of their cap. So they have to do some maneuvering already when that starts. So we'll just kind of see where it goes.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about how bad New Orleans cap hell is, but they're the worst in the NFL, and Dallas is coming up on that too. Next up, though, we have the Seattle Seahawks. Very interesting. I want to say that the NFC West is super interesting. I mean, it's everybody's 4-5 or 5-4 basically across the board, which makes this is going to be the best finish to a division we're going to see this year.
Yeah, and it was funny because I mean this past result, which they lost the game in overtime, they went from starting the week first place to being last place going into their bye, just one result from Matthew Stafford completed a game-winning touchdown. But this is just kind of a team that they were 12 after this first one, but they had 3 straight games against a banged up Miami, a New England, and a Denver, so they won all 3 of the games they should have, and then they played Detroit close enough to where it was a competitive game, even though they did lose up by 13. But we thought that this was a 500 or below team, and I picked them to be last in the division. That's kind of how this is where I expected them to be one of the best last place teams, and that's kind of what it's really turning into. And coming off of the bye, you're going to have San Francisco on the road and Arizona, who's really been killing it over the last 5 weeks, and then they're on the road against the Jets. So it's not like you have a winnable game coming up to kind of right the wrong of this dropping 5 to 6. So it's kind of scary where they're heading, but they're still there for now.
Well, I think something important about this team is that they did lose both of their division games.
Yes.
So being 0-2 in that division is going to make it very difficult to make the playoffs because it's so close.
On top of that, being 4-5, only one of those wins came against an NFC team. So It's not like they're having a ton of tiebreakers that they're building up either.
Yep. And then looking at the Denver Broncos, Denver actually is one of the biggest surprises in the whole NFL. We talked about them in the preseason coming into this, that we were higher on them. As you can tell, they did move up 2 spots. But we had, we liked Bo Nix. Bo Nix is, an older quarterback, more ready for the game of NFL football because he has played so long through college, and he was capable of stepping in. After his first 2 weeks, he's been 5-2, which is really solid for a team.
It's been impressive. They won 5 of 6 before kind of getting handled by Baltimore this past week, and then they got to go right after that follow up on the road against Kansas City. So It's a tough 2-game stretch.
Well, and Atlanta.
But you got to give credit where it's due, because everybody had this as a bottom 5 team, and we were some of the few that actually thought they could flirt with 7, maybe 8 wins.
Oh, yeah.
And they're well on their way. I mean, they're 1 game away from already hitting their over. I think a lot of teams were at 5.5, but they were at 5 for a long time before it was really kind of juiced. So, they're kind of doing better than what their roster suggests they should. And just kind of see where it is. I still think they are going to be on the outside looking in when it's all said and done.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
But, it's reasonable to assume that they might be still in the thick of things, once they get to the week 17, week 18 against Cincinnati, Kansas City, respectively, and just kind of seeing where the chips fall at that point.
Yeah, and I want to say their defense, a bunch of no-names have been playing great. Riley Moss and Pat Surtain, great corners. Riley Moss is one of the highest graded by PFF. So they're doing a lot of things on defense that is allowing them to stay in these games, and that's what 41 points by Baltimore wasn't good, but you know what I mean. Every other game they've done pretty well keeping people in check. Then the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, I hate that they're this far down, because it just sucks that it has a lot to do with injury. So both Chris Godwin and Mike Evans being out, Antoine Winfield and Vita Vea have been out multiple times throughout the year, best players on their teams. And last night, because we're recording this on Tuesday, last night, Kansas City in overtime and almost won that game. Lost in overtime twice this year. So both times didn't get the ball.
Yeah, it's definitely unfortunate. It all kicked off from that first Thursday night game against Atlanta. But all of these games that they lost, Atlanta, Baltimore, Atlanta again, and then Kansas City, they were right down to the end. And Baker is playing his ass off. And some stats may not reflect it, but I mean, there's no reason you should be going into an undefeated Kansas City down your top 3 receivers and should have, in my opinion, I would have
gone for 2 at that point. I agree. Completely agree with you there.
But at the same time, being in that situation, being capable of being that close, it's just like, man, they might not make the playoffs, but they would have a sneaky dog upside once again if they were able to get in this year. I just don't know if they can at this point. Right before their bye, they have a home game against San Fran, who is off by themselves. So they might be going into the bye at 4-6, but then they have the Giants, Carolina, and the Raiders right after that. So a really good stretch to get back on track if they can. And then they finish off against a banged up Dallas, a Carolina at home, and a New Orleans at home. So
I think this team could get in, but the problem is you have this this division called the NFC North,
Mm-hmm.
and they mess everything up because they might get all 4 teams in, and that's what messes up my thoughts on like Tampa Bay getting in, is because I like Tampa Bay, but I just have a hard time seeing them winning 10 games at
Yeah,
this point.
and
So that's my problem with
I
it,
still think
unfortunately.
I still think the last team, like 9, is the target.
Mhm.
But again, we can't also negate the NFC East has 2 6-2 or better teams, or NFC West. I mean, San Fran's still the favorite to win the division. Well, that leaves out an Arizona or Rams who have won
Yep,
multiple games in a row. So
it's a lot
a
to.
lot of teams are going to miss that. We're just like, man, these teams would,
They're good.
yeah.
They're just good at football, and yeah, they're gonna miss. Last one on this slide is the Cincinnati Bengals. They're also too low for their talent on the team. Defensively, they're not that great. We've seen a lot of things come out about that. Trey Hendrickson did get, I believe, back-to-back Defensive Player of the Weeks for the AFC. He has the most sacks in the NFL, so he is very good at football. But they are just behind the 8 ball right now defensively. So
And the problem is, like, they're winning the games they're supposed to, but they're losing every game that is, would be a good quality win,
right.
because nobody is going to, high five you for beating Carolina, the Giants, the Browns, or the Raiders, who we've already talked about all being in the bottom 7 or 8 of our rankings, and then losing to Washington, Kansas City, Baltimore, Philly, who are all in our top 10. You got to start beating some of these teams
For sure.
to get back to where we thought you would be. And this week it starts, because on the road, Thursday night football against the Baltimore Ravens. And if you are
Great game.
down and you get swept that game, not only are you down 3 games to them in the division, but you also got swept by them. So you'll have a long climb ahead if you are going to turn this around at some point.
Yep. And then going to the next slide, we start with the Chicago Bears. The Chicago Bears need to fire Matt Eberflus. That's my thoughts on it. You just have to, like, and of course I know Washington was a whole thing. The Hail Mary, it sucks. And Tyreek Stevenson should get in trouble by the team for how he acted, of course. But there are just games where you need more out of your offense, and they have the talent, and they're just not getting it because of play calling and things like that. So that's kind of where I'm at with it.
I mean, the Washington game would have been a great win if they would have held on. It could consider it fluky all you want to, but it wasn't fluky getting dominated the way they did by Arizona.
No.
And it's just like, you can't keep on having these duds, coming out of buys and stuff like that, having the many coaching issues that you had against Washington off a bye, and then against Arizona, following that up. Usually teams, if you lose in an embarrassing way or just lose a game you were supposed to win, you come out fired up to rectify that, and they got even worse, and that was their worst loss of the season so far. So
I want to also add, they are awful away, so they are 0-4 in away games and 4-0 in home games. So that's where we need to get better, and we need to talk. We need to push for that.
It's going
trying
to be
to figure that out,
because these next 3 weeks, again, home the next 3 weeks, and then on the road the following 3 weeks.
Yes.
So it is boom, boom, boom to get right back into the win columns. And then you got 3 tough road games against Detroit, San Fran, and Minnesota. All of them basically primetime or in, TV spots.
right?
So you need to win at least one of those, maybe even 2 of them. On top of that, winning the games that you're supposed to at home. So I still am not backing off of them getting in, and then being one of the last teams to do that, upset Green Bay, like one of our bold predictions indicated. But they still need to kind of prove me right in the sense.
Yeah,
I'm not necessarily confident in it. I'm just not moving off of it yet.
No, I completely agree with that, because I just think the problem is I can't trust them, and every Chicago Bears fan will tell you that there's an issue with being, this team will mess it up somehow, and I think it has a lot to do with coaching, in my personal opinion. Next up is the LA Rams. 4 losses in the first 5 weeks, and then 3 in a row wins, including winning against the Minnesota Vikings, who at that point were undefeated. So big time. And then they go last week and win in overtime. So they're rolling in the right direction. It's really good to see.
This is actually how you respond after coming off a bye, decimated by injuries, and you come, and this is what shows a well-coached team is, it wasn't a sexy win, but you got it done against the Raiders, and then Minnesota, losing a heartbreaking first game, and then short week, you're a home dog against Minnesota, come out and win that game, and then Seattle, obviously, that's a great win, even though they were favored. to overtake the division, get a division game back, because you already did drop 4 NFC games to start the year.
Right.
So they're in the right spot, and all of a sudden they're just kind of riding the thick of things. Everybody, like you said, is 5-4 or 4-5, and they're 4-4 because they got a bye week. So go ahead.
I was going to say their schedule is also not terrible for the next 4 weeks. That gives me a lot of promise that they could be a 7-win team coming off of these games. Looking at it, going to at Miami at home, that's a really far flight. Just so everybody knows, that is full cross country. And then at New England, also full cross country, but not as well coached and played team in New England. Philly at home, and then at New Orleans, who's fallen apart. All 4 of those games are winnable. If they do that, 8-4 Rams, we'll be talking about them as a top 7, top 8 team on this next.
I think it's just mainly that you have the teams on the road that you kind of want to. Other than San Francisco, who you're going to play every year by default on the road, you have New Orleans, New England, and the Jets. Those are your road games. Everybody else is at home. Maybe because it's a somewhat neutral site game, you'll drop games to a Buffalo or something like that. But your last 2 being division games and being at home are going to be really good in terms of trying to break tiebreakers and get ahead of these guys. Because I don't think that 3 teams are making it, but I'm really even concerned that 2 teams will make it out. And so if they're fighting between them and San Francisco, who they already have a game on, so they lose that San Fran game, they can still set themselves up to be in a good spot, get to 10 wins, and win this division.
Absolutely. The Los Angeles Chargers completely killing it this year. Great coaching. Wow. Well, that's all it took was good coaching for them to be a legit contender to, make the playoffs. Last year, obviously, we did not appreciate the coaching, but this year it has looked really good. Justin Herbert has looked good in the last 4 weeks. 4-1 through the last 4 weeks, 3 away games. Now they get 3 home games in a row, which is going to be really big for them. Tennessee, Cincinnati, and Baltimore, big games.
Right. Yeah, and don't let the previous rank losing by 1 make it any reflection of how much we have been impressed by and like this team. They just have had 3 subpar wins, and then they dropped the one against Arizona that if they won all 4, they might be flirting with our top 10.
Right.
Which in the grand scheme of things, not a terrible loss because it's non-conference. But like you said, 3 straight home games following up, and then you got some tough 3-game stretch, but then you finish it. Denver, New England, Las Vegas Raiders. So they're basically setting themselves up real nice to where they're probably one of the safest teams to bet on winning the wild card or winning a wild card spot. Obviously, Kansas City's running away with the division. But they probably are flirting with being the 5 or 6 seed, and it's just kind of a matchup thing based on who they're going to have to face on the road. Because right now, I believe that would be the Texans being
Pittsburgh. Looks like
okay.
Right now it's Pittsburgh.
Gotcha. So I mean, and again, that's probably if I had to pick a team. Well, no, that probably wouldn't be my preference. Going on the road to Pittsburgh versus on the road to Houston. But they're in a good spot to just continue doing their thing. And I don't think that at this point they're capable of falling apart based on the quarterback they have in place and the head coach who is turning this program around.
Quarterback, 2 left and right tackle, running back, J.K. Dobbins resurgence, Jim Harbaugh. I mean, what else do you need? I mean, 2 edge rushers. How about that? Add that to it too, right?
And Johnston's making.
Why not?
Plays.
Yeah, why not? Glad McConkey's good at football, like we said before he was drafted. So yeah, they're a really solid team. San Francisco next up, 4-4. The 4-4 that they are though is between really good teams. They have lost to 4 good teams, so can't fault them for losing to Minnesota, the Rams, Arizona, and Kansas City. Then also they do win the games that they're supposed to, but you want to see them win one of those games with, that's a tough game.
The Rams and the Cardinals, they were up 2 scores on both. Both of those are also division losses, so that's going to be huge, especially if only one can get out of this division. But they did drop a ton since we last saw them. We still haven't seen Christian McCaffrey debut. It sounds like he will this week, but since then, Brandon Ayuk has been lost for the year, and their defense just is not playing great.
Right.
Like we've seen them in years past. So they're just kind of, right in the middle, and they're talented enough to get back into the top 10 and be, a wild card team or even division champ. But I don't feel as threatened by them as I did even last year.
Yep, absolutely. And then going on to the next slide here, excuse me, the Arizona Cardinals, 1 spot above their division rival at this point.
Mm-hmm.
They will be playing, I believe, in a couple weeks.
No, they're the last week 18.
Oh,
So
last
that
game.
might be
Okay,
the
that's a big game
prime
then.
time.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. They moved up 13 spots, which is awesome to
Yeah.
see. Biggest
mover.
biggest mover of the group. They do get some pretty easy games and then a bye. Minnesota's their toughest game, but Seattle is interesting because if you look at Seattle against Arizona, that game is very telling of how this division will go too.
Yeah, and if you're just kind of say at a pick 'em in a neutral site, like there's probably 3 or 4 teams just ranked right behind them that I would probably favor or pick to win outright. However, when you are beating San Francisco like you are, or the Chargers last second, 3 of the last 4 wins that they've had have been last second field goals. So they're winning, those kinds of games, which is awesome. But then also, you have games this week where I am kind of concerned that they might just all of a sudden drop against the Jets, which not a huge deal in a tiebreaker grand scheme of things, but you also, I don't think you have a leg to stand on if you just draw games you're supposed to win.
Right, for sure.
So, we'll just see if they continue to prove us right. But we said that they would be a sneaky team to flirt with being a wild card team to start the year. And right now they're leading the division through 9 weeks. So it's kind of been proving us right in that regard.
I think the biggest problem for them is they have duds. Getting beat by Washington by 28 and then also getting beat by
21
to Green Bay. Yeah, like those games just can't happen. But otherwise, they've been very impressive. Fun to watch. They're a fun team to watch in general. So that makes it always also better. The next team is the Atlanta Falcons. Look, guys, they're good and they're going to make the playoffs and they're going to be the 1 seed in the NFC South because it sucks. And they're probably just a team that I just feel like I think we're overvaluing their ability a little bit.
No,
and it's hard for me. Of course, we're putting them at 11, which is actually lower than I bet a bunch of people are ranking them power ranking wise. I haven't checked, but like they're a team that worries me more than anything.
For sure, I think if you had to pick between a Detroit Lions or a Commanders / Eagles or a 49ers, maybe if it was the Cardinals it'd be different, but let's say 49ers or the Rams, they're probably the team I'd be most looking forward to facing if I'm a road team in a wild card spot. So if they end up being, I think they really need to try their best because they have gotten through the toughest part of their schedule. Now it's just a lot of easy games. I mean, you see New Orleans, Denver, Raiders, home games against Chargers, Giants, Panthers, Washington, and Minnesota will be good games, but you need to win enough to where if you can get to 11 or even 12 and avoid having the toughest wild card team, I think that's going to be a huge deal because I feel like everybody's going to set themselves up. If they are by default the 4 seed, everybody's going to try to position themselves to play them and then beat them.
Exactly. They are 10th by, so we're not that far off actually, but they're 10th by ESPN. So I thought they'd be higher. And then next up we've got the Green Bay Packers at 10, moved up 5 spots. They had a hard start to the season. And Jordan Love being injured doesn't help, but we actually ranked them after the Minnesota game that they lost by 2. Since then, they've won 4 games. I apologize. Lost to the Detroit Lions this last week, but that's the best team in football. So
it is the best team in football. It was also a monsoon. It poured all game. That doesn't adhere to their strengths compared to a Detroit team that does want to play smash mouth football with you and control the clock. They're good. I give them kudos to being able to be 6-3 with the multiple injuries that they've dealt with.
Absolutely.
At Jordan Love and Malik Willis, shout out to him because he was traded the week of the season starting, and then coincidentally has to start weeks 2 and 3 and holds down the fort. They win those games, and then he comes in against Jacksonville when Jordan Love went down and had them hold on, and so that's exactly what you want as a backup. And in a division that is as good as the NFC North is, any one of those games you drop, you're probably in last or tied for last place. So, I still am kind of concerned because there is a lot of tough games to follow. I mean, you still got to play on the road against Detroit and a San Fran team, a Miami team that is looking to turn it around, and a Minnesota team that will be a tough one. Seattle, Chicago again the last week of the season. So, still a lot of games to be played. But they've set themselves up nicely to get to the 10-win threshold, which is nice to see.
Yep, absolutely. And then the last team on the board is Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, switching quarterbacks from Justin Fields over to Russell Wilson in those two games, they've just kind of they beat both New York teams pretty handily, basically. Neither of those teams we think are very good. So I think after this bye week, when they have to play Washington and Baltimore, we'll really know if that was the best decision for them.
Well, the final 6 weeks was the reason that we were so pessimistic on the Steelers, because it's the worst schedule you could think of, playing Cincinnati, Philly, or your entire division slate, all 6 games, and then your non-division games are Philly and Kansas City. So that's your final 8-game slate. And I can almost guarantee that they will not be this high when we do this in a month.
Yeah, that's fair.
And that's just getting into that schedule because we didn't take account that Washington was going to be good. Mm-hmm. And then Cleveland has, had some upsets against them as well. So, it'll be real interesting. Shout out to Mike Tomlin, because there was a lot of pushback for the Justin Fields decision to put in Russell Wilson, but Russell has looked, following a couple rocky series, which you expected after half a season sitting out.
Right.
He's looked really good to where that doesn't look like a terrible decision right now.
Yeah, for sure. Next up on the screen, you can see the Houston Texans at number 8. I will say I feel like this is high for them because they are probably a team that is trending downwards in most people's eyes, including my own. Losing 2 games in the last 3 weeks to Green Bay and the New York Jets, but at the same time, they're still 6-3. They control their own destiny, and it's not like their division has looked much better than we.
Yeah, they probably have the worst division in football, other than the NFC South. But certainly in the AFC, it's not much competition that you're doing. I'm glad we're doing this rankings a week after, because they were actually in our top 5 before their loss to the Jets.
Mm-hmm.
But this is kind of feels like where the tier break is.
Yes, for sure.
It's them, even though they are on the slide and they deserve to be, because they're winning their division pretty comfortably right now. After this is where you start getting into contenders and who can knock off or has the chance to, host the NFC Championship game or get there. There just doesn't feel like there's a vibe that they can compete with these Baltimore Buffaloes of the world.
Mm-hmm.
They did end up beating Buffalo in week 5, so that is a good tiebreaker game if they end up having the same record. But I still just they give me a lot of cause to pause.
Yep. And then the Buffalo Bills right ahead of them. For Buffalo, I actually think they have a pretty solid schedule coming up that allows them to continue their dominance in this division. Indy is one of the teams that we've talked about already that we're not comfortable with. But then you look at this: Kansas City, San Francisco, the Rams, and then Detroit. That's a fun. If you go 2-2 there, you're pretty happy, right?
Right. Yeah. And
so I think that's interesting.
I feel like they're the biggest threat to Kansas City losing a game this year, because you don't really have the L on the schedule unless you just kind of out of nowhere see an injury, or Mahomes' ankle where he was gimpy after a touchdown is actually more significant than it appears. But they actually have played Kansas City well in the regular season and winning wins. They had a victory against them last year, if I'm not mistaken, before losing close in the playoffs once again. So they're doing well. They're actually outperforming my expectations, just because I thought that they would be in the thick of things for a wild card spot. But with all the losses that they had and didn't really replace it with anything within the draft or free agency, I thought that this would be a team that was just for sure in the wild card, flirting with 9 or 10 wins. But they're already,
they won this division basically already.
I think according to ESPN Analytics, they have a 95% chance. So that's literally Josh Allen gets hurt. Knock on wood, that doesn't happen. But it doesn't feel as forced or like, hey, Josh, you're all we got, like they were last year, and he's actually protecting the football. But that is also correlating with him not going for those 400-yard games. If you're a fantasy fan, like, you're not getting the output that you got with the draft pick that you invested in him.
For sure.
But it's still working out well, and if you're a Buffalo Bill fan, I bet you're pretty happy with how you've seen them so far.
Oh, yeah. I did want to add they end the season with New England, New York Jets, and then New England. We've talked about this multiple times. That's the easiest way to end the schedule for any team in football. So chalk up 3 wins there is how I feel about that. And then Washington Commanders. This is the team that has basically changed everybody's power rankings from the top to the bottom. They have the best chance of winning this division out now that Dallas, of course, without Dak. The Giants are terrible. And then Philly at 6-2 is going to be super interesting when they play each other
really
in 2 weeks on Thursday Night Football. That game is going to be awesome. That is going to be awesome.
We've lined up with a couple of back-to-back bangers on Thursday Night Football that I bet you the schedule makers did not expect.
Right.
Or at least they did in Cincinnati, Baltimore. But Washington and Philly, you didn't think would be the marquee game.
Prime time,
yeah,
for
exactly.
sure.
But yeah, they've been incredible, and on top of that, they're blowing out teams.
Yes.
Or like dominating them where they shouldn't. Even if Chicago, they did have a little luck involved, but they were up 2 scores on them. Chicago did come back and almost take it away, but they took it right back. And then the Giants played them tough as I thought they would, because they always typically do. But yeah, there's not really a bad loss. I wouldn't give a week 1 loss on the road to Tampa Bay, even though it ended up being by 3 scores. A bad loss, plus it's way in the distant past, so it's 9 not even that relevant anymore. And then a tough, back and forth loss against Baltimore 3 weeks ago. So they're in a fantastic spot. They also probably had the most impactful trade at the trade deadline, trading for Marshawn Lattimore, who's still a really solid corner. And if there was a weakness on this team, it was in the secondary.
Fair.
Well, it's getting strengthened a little bit. So it's very exciting to see, because Washington, since the RG3, start to his career that you had, they really haven't been this much of a threat in this division. So it's pretty fresh and welcoming to see, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the Baltimore Ravens, one of the teams that we expect to be up here, of course, but for reasons different than, so they actually moved up, lost a spot, but they were 2-2 when we first did this ranking, losing to both KC and the Raiders early in the year for first week and second week. Since then, they are, I want to believe it's 6-1, losing to only Cleveland in a game where you have no film on, Jameis Winston. He comes out and he just chunks it around the field. So last week they looked really dominant against Denver Broncos, who we talked about was pretty good at football too.
Yeah, they're really good, and they're the reason that they're 5th is because they're the only team in the top 5 with 3 losses.
Right.
2 of them are not so great losses, because they're a home loss to the Raiders and then a road loss to Cleveland against Jameis Winston. But other than that, they're really strong. They're one of the only teams that I can even picture beating a Kansas City right now. And even the teams right in front of them, I would probably pick outright in any kind of, whether it's on the road to them or in a neutral site. But just right now, just got to give the respect where it's due with those teams as well, because they have also been winning.
Fair. Yeah, absolutely. Next up, we're going to go to the next slide here. Philadelphia Eagles going up again, going to get a fun next 4 weeks, in my opinion. Dallas always plays them close, even without Dak. I think that's going to be a good game. Washington on Thursday Night Football, Sunday Night Football against the Rams, and then Baltimore. All games that are going to be fun, winnable games, but not going to be easy by any means. So that would be a good group of teams there.
I still don't trust their coach.
Fair.
Completely. Of the entire probably top 10 teams, they're probably my least confident if it comes down to coaching and scheme at the end of getting it done. There's just all of a sudden, they don't convert 2 tush pushes, and then they want to do rollouts on 4th down and goal at the 1 to try to put games away, and letting teams come back like they are. Granted, they're winning. They actually did run away with it against Cincinnati, but that was a close game. But they're also against Cleveland and Jacksonville, a little too close for my liking. But they won the games they're supposed to. They do have 2 losses against Atlanta and Tampa. But like you said, the most crucial stretch of their season comes the next 4. A lot of fun marquee games. 2 of those are primetime. The other 2 will probably be the main 3 o'clock featured games. So they'll be on TV a lot, and hopefully they put pen to paper for how good they have been, and put that product on the field as well.
For sure. I mean, talent-wise, this team is very talented, top to bottom. You take one of the best rosters in football, possibly top 2 in my personal opinion, just behind Detroit, who's at 1 for us here. Then the Minnesota Vikings. Minnesota came out hot. One of the best teams in football right off the gate. They were our number 1 overall team when we did our first ranking. They did lose 2 back-to-back games, both against NFC teams, which is tough. Detroit, of course, who was number 1, and then the other team they lost to was the Rams. The Rams on that week also just had gotten both Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua back. So that was a tough game to, have to deal with so much options from the Rams, the best Rams team we saw in this year.
I mean, they've been just a fun, pleasant surprise. It feels like it's a regular season team that just might fall apart towards the end, but they just still, if you look at their schedule, they still just, there's not really many just for sure losses on the slate. They still have a couple of AFC South team games to go against, even though the next 3 are on the road.
Right.
But then home games against Atlanta and Arizona, and then Chicago, Seattle, Green Bay, Detroit. Obviously, Detroit, that could be where Detroit's already locked up the division, so they're going to rest people and you get a free game. So, they're in a pretty solid spot to make a wild card team, which I think a lot of people were not expecting this year.
I think we had them at 6-11 or something. So to see them doing so well, Sam Darnold is good at football. We actually, I like making the case that, Sam Darnold's not old. Like, he came out when he was less than 21 years old, and he needed some developmental time, and now he's had it, and now look at him.
Yeah, he's the epitome of, hey, you need a good situation if you're just a talent. It doesn't matter. There's less than 10 quarterbacks probably in the entire modern era of football that could just succeed anywhere. But even the ones that I've said this before, like a Peyton Manning or an Aaron Rodgers or a Dan Marino or John Elway, you feel a little underwhelmed with the amount of stuff that they did end up winning the whole thing. Like, Aaron Rodgers has only been to one and won one.
Right.
It hasn't been in 15 years. Peyton only really won one when he was good. He was carried to the second one.
Right.
And Dan Marino never got back after his second season. Like, those kinds of things is like when you are put in bad situations. But with him in a great spot, the only thing is I hope he goes to one next year, because he's not going to be the quarterback in Minnesota next year, because they did just draft J.J. McCarthy. I think it's best for him that he did sit, even though it's going to be by force this year.
Right,
due to his meniscus injury. But I just hope that he's going to a good spot next year. But I don't know if at this point he can settle down and get a Baker-esque situation where he does find his program. But at the same time, this is not a great quarterback class, and there's a lot of teams in the top 10 that may not want to be going down that route. So we'll just kind of see what happens with him. But it's, kudos to him for having his breakout year finally.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the first place Kansas City Chiefs, 8-0, undefeated, up one spot, jumping the Minnesota Vikings. They just won their game against Tampa Bay last night in overtime to continue being undefeated. A lot of close games. It's not like they're dominating anybody, but they just win. They just win. They just know how to win games. So
Patrick Mahomes is having his worst year of his career, but in the money downs or money quarters when it counts, he's just as good as he has been throughout his career so far. Kind of grouping them in with Detroit. This is purely a die test thing.
Yes,
Detroit truly looks like the best team in football, the way they play and dominate teams, and have not gotten out of their element. Granted, that is also having to do with this past week was their first game outside of a dome this year.
Yep.
And it was a monsoon, and that caters to what they want to do. So they've had good game environments in every single game. Kansas City just has found ways to win, which is what you want and expect for a 2-time champ. There is no hangover there. I really just have a hard time not seeing these two teams meeting come February.
I'm so excited about that. Like, that would be the best way to end, the NFL season, would be Detroit playing Kansas City, a three-peater versus
team that's never been there,
never done it. And then also, best lineup possible, best roster you have in the NFL versus the best quarterback to do it at this point for possibly, the three-peater.
Right.
So it's awesome.
And also for what it's worth, a lot of people have Jared Goff right now as the MVP. I don't know if I would agree with that.
Fair.
But he's been playing well enough. Like, on his win streak right now, he is completing 82% of his passes. He has almost had two different games where he didn't have an incompletion.
Yeah. It's crazy.
So he is having a career year on top of already having a great career. That was probably the best win-win trade in recent NFL history, was Stafford for Jared Goff. And so, it's working out. Now it's Detroit's time. The Rams had their Super Bowl run, and they're still good, but Detroit, now it's their time where they are truly the best team, and they've built their team. I just hope they, grasp the opportunity and not have it fall through their fingers.
Absolutely. But that is the end of our video. We appreciate y'all hanging out with us. That's all 32 teams ranked for us. We got for this power ranking. I think personally that a lot of things will change, obviously, by the next time we do this. Hopefully we get some more. I say this because I want chaos, but I like variation. So, like, we had Arizona jump 13 spots. I hope that happens more for some of these teams. I hope not a lot of, obviously, you don't want a lot of teams just dropping 20 spots.
Well, every year you see a team kind of have a collapse at the second half of the season. You saw that with Philly and Jacksonville last year. And then you also have teams that just kind of make a run, like Tampa Bay did last year. So, that always happens, and that's the beautiful thing about the NFL is that everybody can beat anybody on any given day. So it's a fun thing. Our next power ranking, when it comes out first week of December, that'll be our last one with all 32 teams before we rank the playoff teams going into January, and then we'll do a way too early power rank of the 32 going into the offseason some point early March or late February.
Yeah.
But yeah, we appreciate you guys tuning in. Please let us know your thoughts, where we went right or wrong. Who are we overhyping? Who are we not giving enough love to? Who have you been most impressed by? And who has just kind of been the biggest disappointment? Like a lot of those general questions, but all topics worth discussing.
Yeah, absolutely. We really appreciate y'all hanging out with us. If you haven't yet, please like the video, comment, like Cam said, about some of those things, and then subscribe to the channel so that you can see our content when it comes out. So we really appreciate y'all, and we will see y'all next time.